The sun poured over the neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses of Maplewood Estates, its golden rays barely warming the cold symmetry of the neighborhood. Each house stood like a soldier in a perfectly aligned parade, their facades painted in variations of beige and soft blue. It was a world where conformity was not just encouraged, it was enforced. And at the helm of this ship of uniformity stood Karen, the self-appointed arbiter of all things Maplewood. From my vantage point on the porch, I watched her patrol the street with the intensity of a hawk watching over a field. Her clipboard was a badge of her tireless vigilance, her footsteps an ominous harbinger. She was on a mission always. Her actions were a symphony of pettiness, a carefully orchestrated dance of disapproval and passive aggression. Today, the object of her scrutiny was a fence 3 inches taller than the regulations permitted. She stood there squinting at it as if it had personally insulted her. The fence belonged to the Mitchells, a quiet couple who kept mostly to themselves. Their small rebellion in Cedar had become Karen's latest battle. She had already sent a barrage of emails, each one brimming with bureaucratic jargon and thinly veiled threats. But the fence stood firm, an unwitting symbol of resistance in a neighborhood that discouraged such notions. I sipped my coffee, savoring the warmth as it seeped into my fingers, a stark contrast to Karen's chill. I found it funny in a way that wasn't quite humorous, but had the flavor of irony. Her dedication to order filled the streets not with peace, but tension. The kind that simmered just below the surface, ready to boil over, given the slightest provocation. As Karen moved away, satisfied with her latest note to the Mitchells, I could almost hear the click-clack of her heels echoing her triumph. Yet in her wake, I saw the fluttering of curtains, glimpses of eyes peering out with resentment and fear. She had become a storm cloud, in an otherwise clear sky, casting shadows wherever she went. It wasn't long before my own name appeared on her list. The accusation was trivial grass a shade too wild, daring to grow in ways nature intended rather than the HOA. A letter arrived harsh and formal, demanding compliance. I read it slowly, letting the absurdity wash over me. There was a wry satisfaction in knowing that my dandelions offended her sensibilities. They were yellow defiance, a cheerful middle finger. I could comply, of course, bend to her will as so many had done. But something in me resisted, not out of spite, but out of a quiet certainty that life was more than rules and regulations, more than the sterile perfection. Karen demanded I wanted to keep my dandelions, to let them stretch towards the sun in their unkempt glory. And so I responded in the gentlest way I knew, a polite note thanking her for her vigilance, assuring her I would consider her request. I meant every word, yet the irony was not lost on me. I would consider, and in considering, I would choose to do nothing. There was power in that, in the choice to simply be. Karen wouldn't understand, of course. To her, my inaction was rebellion, my civility an insult. But I carried on tending to my garden with a patience that only time could cultivate, watching as the neighborhood continued its delicate dance around her. The air was thick with expectation, a prelude to something larger. For now I sat sipping my coffee, a quiet observer in a world on the brink of unraveling. The morning sun filtered through my curtains, casting soft ribbons of light across the floor. It was almost peaceful, if not for the simmering anticipation of Karen's next move. Her voice had become a sort of soundtrack to our neighborhood, a shrill chorus echoing through hedgerows and over picket fences. It all started with the trash bins, a simple enough grievance, incorrect placement according to her standards. But Karen's standards were a maze of absurdity, where the rules seemed to breathe and adapt, shape-shifting to her whims. I watched from my window as she snapped pictures of the offending bins, her phone an extension of her pointed finger, each click an invisible citation. Then the letters started. Handwritten notes slipped under doors, chock full of warnings about hedge heights and flag orientations. They were penned in a looping, aggressive script that practically shouted from the page. It was as if the ink itself trembled with her indignation. Rumors grew like weeds in a neglected garden. Whispers of infractions whispered in checkout lines at the local grocery. Neighbors turned suspicious glances toward each other, as if every one of us was complicit in some grand conspiracy against the sanctity of neighborhood aesthetics. Karen relished in this, riding the wave of paranoia she'd crafted. I kept mostly to myself, content to observe the unfolding drama from the edges. There was a strange power in watching chaos unravel from a distance, like being the eye of a storm calm but alert. Yet even I wasn't immune. One morning, a letter with my name scrawled across the envelope appeared. My crime. A garden gnome deemed tacky by her unyielding decree. I smiled at the absurdity of it. A small, whimsical sculpture condemned like a criminal. It seemed almost poetic in its triviality. I considered removing it, but something in me rebelled against the notion. Let it stand, I thought. A monument to defiance, however minor. Karen's patrols became more frequent. The way she prowled the streets, clipboard in hand, reminded me of a self-appointed queen guarding her castle. But her reign was not one of benevolence. It was a tyranny of the mundane, where the slightest deviation was met with swift retribution. I was not the only one to feel the sting of her scrutiny. Families whispered behind closed doors about the unfairness, the inconsistency. Yet overt resistance was rare. Most complied, preferring peace over conflict, even if it meant swallowing their pride. But the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter around us with each passing day. It was only a matter of time before it snapped. And snap it did. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Karen's voice pierced the morning air. It was a crescendo of fury, an operatic explosion over something as trivial as a lawn ornament. I ventured outside, drawn by the commotion. There she was, volume raised to match her indignation as neighbors gathered at their thresholds, spectators to a spectacle too absurd to ignore. Her voice was a whirlwind, scattering accusations like leaves in autumn wind. Then the sirens. Flashing blue and red fractured the early light. Police officers arrived the neighborhood, now an involuntary audience to this unfolding drama. The scene was surreal, like a play where the lines between comedy and tragedy blurred. The officer's calm contrasted starkly with Karen's fury. Her invincibility, once her armor, now crumbled under the weight of authority and bodycam scrutiny. The footage would reveal the truth, unvarnished, indisputable. In that moment, Karen's empire began to waver. The absurdity had reached its zenith, and like any story stretched too thin, reality would crash back in. The fall would be swift and inevitable, her reign reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the very grocery aisles, where her rumors once thrived. And I stayed in the eye of the storm, watching, waiting. The neighborhood would heal. Gardens would grow untamed, and gnomes would stand sentinel once more. The sun was dipping below the horizon. casting a warm golden hue across the neighborhood. A brief moment of serenity before the unfolding storm. I stood in my living room, watching the spectacle outside the window. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes chaos. The silence that echoes with the tension of what's to come. I'd been waiting for this moment, preparing meticulously for weeks. Karen had been relentless. Her voice, shrill and uncompromising, had echoed through our lives like an unwelcome ghost. The HOA meetings, once a tedious formality, had become battlegrounds. Her demands, dressed in the guise of community interest, were personal vendettas. Her latest crusade, a tirade about my garden gnome, was simply another chess move in her game of control. But tonight was different. I had documented everything. Every meeting, every memo, every contrived complaint. My arsenal was a file of detailed notes and a timeline as precise as the ticking of a clock. Evidence that spoke louder than accusations. It was a subtle counter, not an overt attack. A quiet rebellion against the tyranny of pettiness. The truth lay there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment. The air was thick with anticipation as dusk settled in. Shadows stretched long and thin across the pavement. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the liminal space between day and night, peace and turmoil. I felt the weight of the envelope in my hand, the tangible heft of vindication and justice. The police cars arrived first, their lights a kaleidoscope of red and blue that shattered the stillness. Karen was already outside, her presence unmissable, her indignation a storm about to break. Her voice, always a few decibels too loud, pierced the evening air, a discordant note against the symphony of crickets and cicadas. I stood back, a silent observer in this unfolding drama, the architect of my own quiet victory. The officers, calm and professional, approached her. Their body cameras, small and unassuming, were about to capture the truth that had simmered beneath the surface for too long. Karen's face contorted with anger, her gestures exaggerated, painting her own self-portrait of unreason. She was a maestro of manipulation, but tonight her symphony of control would hit a sour note. The Bodycam footage, a silent witness, recorded her unraveling each frame, a testament to her true nature. I watched, detached, yet acutely aware, as the officers navigated the tempest of her accusations. Her voice rose a crescendo of fury, but the officers remained unmoved, their patience unwavering. And then, in the eye of the storm, the moment of irony unfolded. The officers, after enduring her tirade, turned to me, seeking my side of the story. I offered them the envelope, my unspoken testimony. They reviewed the contents, their expressions shifting subtly from skepticism to understanding. The tide was turning slow, yet inexorable, like the setting sun that had dipped beyond the horizon. In the quiet aftermath, the verdict was delivered with a simplicity that belied its significance. Karen was to be banned from the HOA, her reign of terror dismantled by her own hand. The irony was not lost on me. Her voice, once so dominant, was now a whisper, lost in the evening breeze. As the police cars pulled away, their lights fading into the night, I stood alone on my porch. The neighborhood seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving like mist in the morning sun. My garden gnome stood untouched, a symbol of quiet resistance, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful victories are those won in silence. The flash of red and blue lights reflected off the manicured lawns and pristine driveways, Casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood, Karen had screamed herself into hoarse silence by the time I returned from the station. The quiet stretched out heavy and tense, like the anticipation before a storm. Through the open window, I could hear her muffled sobs, punctuated by the occasional hiccup of indignation. It was almost like watching a play unfold, scenes meticulously stitched together by the threads of her own making. I had always known that Karen would overstep one day. Her obsession with the minutiae of our neighborhood's aesthetics, from the precise shade of beige allowed for garden gnomes to the exact height of hedges, had always been a ticking clock. Her voice, shrill and unyielding, had become the background noise of our lives, a constant reminder of the fragile balance she imposed on our existence. It was ironic, really. The same rules she clung to like a lifeline were the ones that unraveled her grip on power. The Bodycam footage was damning in its simplicity, a digital mosaic of her unraveling. Her face twisted in anger, her words a sharp staccato against the quiet professionalism of the responding officer's truth captured in pixels laid bare for all to see. I had learned to navigate her world through silence and observation. I watched her alienate herself, one confrontation at a time. She wielded her position within the HOA like a scepter, a monarch in a kingdom of her own imagining. But there are rules. Even a queen must follow. The night after the footage was released, I took a walk through the neighborhood, the air cool against my skin. It was a ritual of sorts, a way to clear my mind and plan my next steps. The streets were empty, save for the occasional stray cat slipping through the shadows. I breathed deeply, the scent of damp earth and distant pine mingling in the breeze. I made my way to the mailbox. The cedar post sturdy beneath my fingers, the letter was there, waiting a neatly folded missive of change. Inside was the legal confirmation of what I had set in motion weeks before. It was a quiet triumph, the culmination of patience and precision. I had learned long ago that the best revenge is not loud or chaotic, but calm and undeniable. The meeting to discuss Karen's fate was held in the very community hall where she had once dominated with her presence. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, like the moments before a curtain rises. I sat among my neighbors, a sea of familiar faces, each marked by the same weary resignation. They turned to me, silent questions lingering in their eyes. I met their gazes with a quiet nod, acknowledging their unspoken hopes. The decision was swift, a collective realization of the necessity for change. As the votes were counted, a palpable sense of relief settled over us. Karen, for all her bluster and bravado, was out, stripped of her title, her reign at an end. I watched her leave her steps uncertain, her figure diminished in the harsh light of reality. It was the closure we needed, a resolution to the saga that had defined us for too long. And as the door closed behind her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of ironic justice. We were free at last to live without the weight of her watchful gaze. The neighborhood once more belonged to us. A soft breeze whispered through the freshly swept streets as I leaned against my porch railing, sipping coffee from my favorite chipped mug. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the very molecules had rearranged themselves in the wake of last night's spectacle. The community's heart was finally beating in rhythm, its cacophony of chaos, now a distant echo. All thanks to the unraveling of Karen's reign over our homeowners association. The police had come when her screams pierced the night, slicing through the serenity like a jagged knife. Her voice carried a symphony of fury and desperation, shattering the stillness. We watched hidden behind curtains and blinds as the officers approached her, their faces a mixture of patience and steely resolve. The Bodycam footage would capture it all, every shrill accusation, every exaggerated gesture, truth immortalized in pixels. I had always considered myself an observer, a quiet pillar standing on the periphery of our neighborhood's dramas. But watching the officers arrive, I felt a shift. This was the moment we had all been waiting for, the turning of the tide. Karen, who held our lives in the vice grip of her bylaws, was finally meeting the immovable force of reality. And it was mesmerizing. The footage leaked. Of course, a neighbor accidentally forwarded it too widely, and soon everyone had seen her unraveling. There was something almost poetic about it. The woman who had enforced every petty rule now caught in the act of breaking them with her own hysteria. Her screams were no longer authoritative but absurdly theatrical, an opera of her own demise. She was no longer the enforcer, but the spectacle. Her reign ended not with a bang nor a whimper, but with the cold, hard truth. The HOA board convened swiftly in the following days, their decision inevitable. She was stripped of her title. Her bans and fines dissolved like sugar in rain. I marveled at how quickly her empire crumbled once the foundation of fear was removed. The relief was palpable, a sigh of liberation from the entire community. I took another sip of coffee, watching the neighbors slowly emerge onto their lawns as if a spell had been lifted. They greeted each other with cautious smiles, eyes bright with the promise of a new beginning. Gardens once neglected, under the threat of Karen's nitpicking, were now tended to with gentle care. A child's laughter echoed from the street, pure and unburdened. The irony was not lost on me. The force that had held us down was gone, and in its place was a sense of unity, one I'd never thought possible before. Karen was still here, of course, sullen behind her tower and hedges, but she was no longer the sun around which our little universe orbited. She was now a distant star, dim and fading. I found myself wondering what it was like for her now within the confines of her self-made exile. Did she regret? Was there remorse in those moments of solitude? Perhaps. But life, I realized, was too precious for dwelling on the shadows of the past. Our community had survived, and in doing so had been reborn. I stood there a while longer, savoring the quiet transformation before me. We were not just a collection of houses anymore. We were a community, bound by shared experiences and newfound freedom. The streets felt alive again, humming with the energy of possibility, and in that moment, I knew we would be okay. The morning sun continued its ascent, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood. A new chapter waited unwritten, and this time it would be ours to tell.